Welcome to the And She Looked Up Creative Hour podcast with Lisa Bolton and Melissa Hartfield. We're two women who are artists and entrepreneurs, and yes, those two things can go together. This podcast is for the artists, the creators, and the makers who want to find a way to make a living creating what they love. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 18 of the And She Looked Up Creative Hour podcast. I'm Melissa, and today I'm not here with my co-host. I am here with Lisa, but I'm going to be interviewing her today. Today, we are going to be talking about how to land a book deal when nobody knows who you are. So Lisa is the author of the book On Boards, which is a cookbook / lifestyle book. That's kind of what I would classify it as, Lisa. I think
that's fair. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's equal parts cookbook and equal parts lifestyle and entertaining. So Lisa's book On Boards was published in October of 2018 by Appetite by Penguin Random House. It is a best-selling book, but when Lisa first submitted her book proposal, nobody really knew who she was. And one of the things, particularly in the food blogging world, although this is not a food blogging specific episode, is that you are told over and over again that if you want to land a book deal, you need to have a big social following. There's definitely pros to having a big social following if you want to land a book deal, but Lisa didn't have that, and she tackled her entire book proposal process very differently, I think, than a lot of people do. And so we thought it would be really interesting to sit down and talk to her today about how exactly she managed to not just get a cookbook deal, but also have a best-selling book when nobody really knew who she was. We all know who you are now, Lisa. We love you. This is an interesting episode for anybody who is who thinks they have something interesting to say in the world of nonfiction. So I think fiction is a different category. We're not really addressing that today. But I think from a nonfiction perspective, there are a lot of us out there who are doing things very differently, very creatively, who might feel that others could benefit from learning from us about how we're doing things. And maybe a book is something that's been in the back of your mind, but you've kind of talked yourself out of it because you don't have a big enough following, you don't have enough website traffic, all the reasons that we can kind of talk ourselves out of doing anything. But Lisa, you did the opposite. You talked yourself into it and you did it.
I did. Yeah. And you summed it up really well. And I think the way I've summed it up for people, one of the things after I published my book is I did a bit of speaking in front of some groups, and I had the pleasure of being one of the keynote speakers at the Indigo Managers convention that they had. And I was able to talk about my journey. And I opened my speech with the fact that I was the best person to write this book because I was the least likely person to write this book. That is actually, I believe, how I even opened my proposal. And my point is that I had no business writing a cookbook and more or less getting it published with a major publisher. I didn't have a following, to your point. I think you're very kind about that. I had a very, very small following, but it was certainly nothing that influenced. I was trying to find my exact numbers. I think it was under 1,000 on Instagram and definitely under 1,000 on Facebook, like just very, very small, and had worked hard just to kind of slowly grind to get to that level. So had a very, very small following. I also was very late into the game of food. Like I did not have a cooking background, never taken a cooking class, no professional training. I think the closest I ever came to working in a restaurant was maybe bussing tables at the Butchart Gardens in Victoria, BC, putting myself through university. So my story, what made it somewhat different was that I was very unlikely. I was not someone who grew up with stories of cooking in the kitchen with my mother, even though she's a beautiful cook. That wasn't my experience. I didn't have that in my blood from a young age. But I will say that I did have a desire to write a book from a young age. And I was in university and I had the opportunity to interview Peter Legge, who is a well-known Canadian writer, entrepreneur, inspirational speaker, really interesting man. And I remember interviewing him and talking to him about, I had this desire to maybe write a book, but it was always going to be a nonfiction book based on personal finance for young people, because I really felt that was a gap back, 20 years ago. There wasn't a lot of people talking about it and teaching it to, university students or late high school students.
Still a gap.
Still a gap. It is.
You could write that book now.
My interest in the book was basically because I felt there was a gap in the marketplace. So that's really where the desire came. And now, of course, I never did write that book, but I always thought it would have been interesting to send Mr. Legg a copy of my cookbook and say, I did end up writing a book. It was just not what I thought it was going to be.
For those of you who might be listening outside of Canada, Indigo is sort of Indigo Chapters. They are Canada's largest book selling chain. So it would be similar to like a Barnes and Noble or something in the US, just so people know.
Point. Yes. So it was always in the back of my mind. And then I think, if you've listened to Melissa interview me back in our second episode earlier on, and I've talked about my journey there, but I did make a bit of a career change later in life and started exploring the world of food. And that really was when I first kind of got the inkling of, maybe a book actually could be in my future. But at the time, anybody getting a book deal had not like thousands of followers, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of followers. And any article that was read about cookbooks where you were either celebrities were making books, you were a chef already that had a string of restaurants, or you were someone with 100,000 people following you on Instagram or Facebook. You were essentially bringing a pool of buyers to the table. And that's who were getting cookbook deals. And so as much as I kind of thought about it for a minute, I definitely sort of tucked it back in the archives because I didn't fit the criteria of how they were traditionally publishing cookbooks at the time. And this is going back into sort of 2013, 2014 in that time frame.
Yeah, one of the reasons why you see so many cookbooks published by bloggers today is because they do come with a built-in platform. They usually have a very loyal and large audience base that is a built-in audience to buy that book. But if you don't have that, it can be very intimidating to even entertain the idea of a book. This isn't just for food bloggers, but really anyone in any kind of niche, I guess, especially if you're niche, because sometimes when you're niche, your audience is even smaller because you appeal to a very specific group. But I guess my first question is, what made you think that you might just have an idea that could become a book? I think that's a big stumbling block for a lot of people. It's like, I'd love to write a book, but I don't really know what I'd write about. Or what happened that you kind of went, this could be something?
Well, it really came out of when I started to develop a passion for making these beautiful boards. I was cooking a lot. I had a young son at the time, and I was definitely cooking what I would call thoughtfully presented family food. So I had my own spin on what I created. Not only did I want it to taste great, and I was very much focused on whole food ingredients, but I felt like family meals could be more thoughtfully presented. I focused a lot on that. So I was focusing on the food styling, and I took a real liking to the niche of making food look beautiful. Now, fast forward to 2020, I've got a different opinion on that, and I feel like the needle has just moved to an impossible volume for my taste now. But back then, I felt that it was something that really brought me a lot of joy, and I really appreciated the art of styling food. And then as I started to shift the food styling I was doing into cheese boards, I was having a lot of fun with it. I was learning. People were always asking me questions. And I just started to realize that this was more than just making a cheese board. When I would bring a cheese board over, this was about the experience as well. So it was about evoking emotion. It was about bringing people together. It was about not wanting to miss whatever gathering that cheese board was going to. And I didn't feel like cooking the best spaghetti in the world evoked that same emotion. So I just felt there was something different about a cheese board that stood out. To create a bit of a timeline, my book was published in October of 2018. I got the book deal January of 2017. Probably started negotiating on that back in October of 2016. The proposal took me about a year and a half. And it wasn't something I was sitting down and working on every day. But when I really started to say, I'm going to start jotting down some notes, like I felt like, there's no one out there. There's no books out there like this. I would scan the cookbook area. There's nothing out there that is like this. There's books on cheese, there's books on making charcuterie, there's books on appetizers, but there just wasn't anything in this silo about how to make a beautiful cheese board. That was sort of the first instinct to say, I'm going to start making some notes. I'm going to just start thinking this through on a kind of a casual bit of the ground in between blog posts and recipe development. If I kind of had an idea or if I really liked a particular cheese board I made, I'd make sure I captured it and just made some notes. I was very careful not to put any of my cheese boards out there at this point in time. I didn't have them on my blog. I didn't have a post on how to make the perfect cheese board. I didn't have anything like that. I just kept it very quiet and insular, and I really didn't kind of wanted to protect it because I knew I had something special there.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think a lot of people would have almost felt that was the backwards way to do it. Like, especially when you didn't have much of a following, like, oh, maybe they would think completely the opposite. Like, this is a great idea for a book, and now I need to convince people that I'm the expert on it so that I can get a book deal. But you actually kind of went the opposite way.
I've long suffered from a bit of that imposter syndrome, a little bit of credibility issue. And so I think I never felt like I had the credibility at the time. So it felt very private to me. And I thought, I'll just keep this quiet. And there's definitely been people who have since published books on cheese boards that have done it the opposite way. They've put them all over Instagram and have big blogs and have developed huge followings of people who have then turned them into book buyers. So it definitely can be done the opposite way. If you've already got a craft or an art that you do and you've got a big following, I mean, they're going to be your biggest fans. But sometimes those ideas that you have, keeping them quiet and personal and just really timing it right before you start going out with that information, it's a strategic decision.
Definitely. I think you were very strategic throughout the whole process. So I guess you've kind of alluded to it a little bit, but once you had the idea that this could be something and that there was potential here, what were your next steps? Because I know you had this idea quite a while before you actually got to the book proposal stage. Like, you knew you had an idea, you knew that not a lot of people knew who you were. You know, I'm sure you had heard all the talk about you got to have a platform, you got to have a follower. So how did you strategize?
I do believe in the power of preparation and anticipating what my other party needs. I knew what I didn't have. So I knew I didn't have a platform.
By other party, you mean like a potential publisher? Like, what do they need from you as a potential author?
So to be clear, I did a little bit of research to determine whether I wanted to get an agent or not. So when you're looking at publishing a book, you can self-publish or traditional publish. So self-publishing being much like what it sounds like. You drive most of the work. So you're in charge of sourcing design, printing, layout, distribution, everything that you can imagine that goes into getting that book to your customer. Or you can go a traditional publishing house, which takes care of a lot of those logistics for you. So from the beginning, because I didn't have a platform, everything I read said no agent is even going to look at you. If you've ever looked at trying to reach out to a literary agent in any field, it was the most unwelcoming experience I'd ever had. Like, literally, I come from a world of where you're trying to get business and trying to get customers. That's usually the central focus. And I would look up these contact pages for these literary agents, and it was basically like, don't call me, I'll call you. And here's everything we want. And you're welcome to send stuff, but I'm probably not going to get back to you. And it was just very disheartening. And so that was a bit of a turnoff for me. So I thought, I believe so much in this idea that I need to think of all the reasons that traditional publisher is going to say no. I'm going to focus on rebuttals to those reasons. So I knew that everything in my book, because I felt the idea was solid. You either got the idea or you didn't. And there are people that still don't understand why you'd buy a book with a bunch of cheese boards in it, which I completely understand. But I knew that if you got the idea of the book, I could take care of the rest. I felt like the business model would support it successfully making it to shelves. I didn't make the proposal about me. The about me section was very, very short. It was the smallest part of it because I wasn't this big name coming to the table. I wasn't someone bringing my 100,000 followers. People weren't buying the book because of who I was. I was bringing a feeling, an experience, a concept, a aspiration that people wanted. And so I focused on that. The feedback I've heard from people in the past is a lot of these book proposals, and even my experience as a commercial lender, these business plans, they focus so much on the individual. I needed to alleviate the person I was trying to sell this to. I needed to alleviate their fears. I needed to bring them comfort and make it easier to sell to their boss. So that's the lens through which I wrote my proposal.
Yes. Okay, and this does not just apply to book proposals. This is the biggest mistake I see so many entrepreneurs make when they're pitching, any kind of pitching, whether it's a book proposal, whether it's to a potential new client, a magazine editor, or just anything, is that they make the pitch about themselves. Mm-hmm. And that is absolutely the wrong way to go about pitching yourself for anything. The pitch should always be about solving a problem for the person you're pitching. What is their biggest problem? How can you solve it? How are you going to make it easy for them? You never want to pitch something where you're making it hard for the person who's being pitched to even fathom why this would be a good thing for them. I think your banking background mm-hmm. made you a prime candidate for understanding, like just intuitively understanding that in order to pitch this book idea, you were going to have to go to the potential publisher and say, like, this is a gap that I see that you could fill, and here is how I think you could fill it, and lay it all out for them, from numbers to a marketing plan to, like, make it so that there's no other way that they can see moving forward, because it's just got success written all over it. Like, you've just been so thorough and made it so crystal clear to them how this could not lose.
Yeah, I think you're right about it applying to whatever your craft is, like whatever your business is. I mean, it's not to say you shouldn't talk about how great the concept is or how great you are and why you're the person to do it. That has a place in any proposal or pitch. But putting yourself in the other person's shoes, people are inherently selfish. If you're in a position to make that decision, you're thinking, what's in it for me? What have I got to lose by taking a risk on this? And if the person coming at you says, oh, got it covered, it's so much easier to say yes to things.
You're essentially checking all the boxes on their list. Like every business, before they enter into something that is potentially going to make them money, hopefully, they have a checklist of things that they go through. Like, and if it checks all the boxes, you've just made it that much easier for them to say yes to you. Whereas if you just go to them and say, I have this great idea and I think, you should do it because I have 100,000 followers, like, what else you got? That's just one piece of the puzzle. I've got 10 other boxes on my checklist that I need to check off. Like, you've just checked off one of them. What about these other 10? So
exactly.
I think that's really a key thing to remember whenever you're pitching anyone for anything. Your job is to sell them on why it's a great idea for them. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's a great idea for you at the same time, but you don't necessarily need to emphasize that piece of it quite so much.
Exactly. It should be centric around the person you're trying to sell to, not about yourself.
And that's why you can't blanket pitch. Pitches have to be personalized to mm-hmm. who you're sending them to, whether it's different publishers. I think that's also an important thing to kind of recognize, is that not all publishers are the same. Your book was published with Appetite, which is what's called an imprint for Penguin Random House. And Penguin Random House has lots of imprints, but your book was right for the Appetite imprint. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something you need to do as part of any kind of pitch, is really research who the person you're going to be talking to, or the people that you're going to be talking to. What is their specific niche, market, target audience, all those types of things. And I think a lot of people fail to do that.
Yeah, I definitely recommend, in whatever niche you're in, and for me, being in the cookbook world, I was going through a lot of the different cookbook publishers, the different cookbook literary agents. Doing my research made it easy to cross a lot off the list. Yeah. And I knew who I didn't want to work with, or that wouldn't be a fit for me. And I wouldn't be a fit for them either. Like, I knew right away, there's no point in going down that road. It was much easier for me to sit at home and do that research than to be going out and just blanketing in this huge net and seeing what what fish I caught. So I was very specific on who I wanted to reach out to and who I wanted to connect with.
So what were the kinds of things that you researched? You mentioned an agent, you mentioned different publishing houses. What other kinds of things were you kind of doing your due diligence on before you even got to the proposal stage?
I read a lot of articles, and one book in particular, Diane Jacob wrote a book, Will Write for Food, which is all about getting a book published. And I read a lot of articles about, so you want to write a cookbook. When I read these books and articles, there was lots I took away and there was lots I threw out, because this is also true. A lot of those books, if I had followed their advice, I never would have written a proposal. Like they all said what I spoke to earlier, you need credibility, you need platform, you need to come with this resume behind you and be the best in your field. And I, in my heart of hearts, did not believe that needed to be true. I thought one of the things that made my book very saleable was that I was a regular person. And so that if I could do this, I wanted people to know that then they could do it too. You didn't have to be special. I have a lot of beautiful books on my shelf, especially cookbooks, that I will never cook from. I bought them. I'm not cooking for them. I mean, they're just beyond my skill level. They're beautiful pieces of art, but they're not a book that I have an emotional connection to. I know I could write something and say, I'm a regular Joe, and I was able to make these boards, and I can teach you how to do it, because just like me, you don't have any special training either. So I felt that, I was getting a lot of advice that said you needed to be the expert in your field. I don't know that that's necessarily true. If your passion is there, I was passionate about making those boards, and I was passionate about the feelings that it brought to people. That came through in my proposal. I knew that. I knew that in the heart of my idea. So I would hate for articles and books about getting a book deal to discourage people from doing the work. I liked the work. I liked doing the research as to what I wanted to make sure was in my proposal, and really knew it like the back of my hand. And so you have to have a subject matter that you don't mind getting very intimate with for a lot of years.
Yeah, it's a long
Long process.
You did say something interesting there, though, about how if you had followed everything that a lot of these articles and books said, you wouldn't have had a proposal or had gone through the process of putting a proposal out there. And I think that's really interesting, because I do think there's always more than one way to achieve a goal. Usually there's many ways to achieve a goal. What's important about doing your research is that you learn the rules, which I'm putting in quotation marks. You can't see that, but I'm there are rules in every industry of how things are supposed to be done. And it is important that you understand what those rules are, because you can't really break them until you kind of know, like, okay, this is considered a rule, but I'm not going to do that, and here's why. So you have like some logic behind what you're doing. So I am all for rule breaking, but I do think you need to do your research first to kind of have an understanding of how the industry that you're in actually works first, so that you can strategically break the rules.
Yeah. And I mean, the biggest rule I was breaking was the lack of any sort of platform. I would say that credibility wise, yes, I wasn't a chef or didn't have a culinary experience professionally, but my book wasn't focused on that. It was really focused on the artful arrangement and pairing of food. So I felt like that was a secondary hurdle I needed to cover. My first hurdle was I didn't have 100,000 people that I could say were going to come and buy my book. And so when I designed the proposal, that was centric to it. That was the biggest obstacle I needed to overcome, because I know any publisher that looks at it is looking at what we would call a P&L, is looking at a profit and loss and saying, how much is this book going to cost me to make, and what's the profit at the end of the day? And so I needed to bring crystal clear clarity to why people who didn't know me were going to buy this book.
Okay, so let's talk about the proposal itself, because I think book proposals, I think, are a big mystery to a lot of people. Like, what is a book proposal? What do you put in a book proposal? So maybe let's start with some of those things. Like, what did you actually put in your book proposal? Like, what?
Sure. Well, and that's funny, because I will say when I did hand in my proposal, they were like, wow, we haven't seen one with spreadsheets before. So for me, and I think that was the unique piece I brought, it was that having spent so much time in banking, having an MBA, having done my MBA in entrepreneurship, I felt very comfortable with business plans. So if you're starting up a business and of any size, I'd highly recommend you go through the process of a business plan, which is essentially just kind of doing research on all the areas that it takes to run a business. And a book proposal is not that much different. What I knew I had to do was take what was recommended by industry experts. So reading books about cookbook proposals and paying attention to what they said it was important, but then taking it and putting my own spin on it and sort of applying a bit of a business plan perspective to it. At a high level, I really talked about the concept, sort of why me, why now? So why I should write this book and why the timing was right. One of the key things I was very clear on in my book was my commitment to the timeline. This is how long it'll take me, and this is how I'm going to meet that timeline. Because they want to know, immediately they're thinking, when are we going to publish this book? Because if you're going with a traditional publisher, you're likely 18 months before your book is actually coming to market, probably best case scenario these days. So you're 18 to 24 months. So right away, you need to start doing the math on that and making sure that by the time you finish writing this proposal, get it shopped around, get it locked down, and then you create the content for the book, and then it goes to printing, then it goes to market, that your idea hasn't long been gone by then. They make sure that it's evergreen enough to survive that time frame. So I was very clear about that sort of why me, why now, bit of the timeline.
For people who are kind of not sure what a book proposal is, I think just so you understand that piece, a book proposal is something that you put together to present to either an agent or a publisher that explains to them all the pieces of the book, what the actual idea of the book is, what's going to be included in the book, a bit of a marketing plan, a bit of a business plan, and a little bit about yourself, I think. But it's basically the piece that you present to a publisher in the hopes that they will consider this as an option for a book that could be then written. So like you have to put the proposal forward before you get the book deal.
Yes, exactly. So it's taking the pieces that are necessary to get the book to shelves, writing them out, binding this up into what became, I don't know, I think mine was like 20 pages or so.
I believe is actually a fairly large.
Probably larger than it even maybe needed to be, but I was very thorough.
You had those spreadsheets.
I had those spreadsheets. It also typically contains samples, chapters, sample table of contents. So It really is everything that would be needed to get the book out. And it's something that you would do up prior to any meeting, in most cases, meeting with a publisher. So before you're reaching out to publishers, you really want to have 80% of your proposal done, which is what I had. When I met with the publisher, I was 85% done. I had a little bit of tweaking, but I wanted to make sure that I was there wasn't anything extra. Like, again, speaking back to making sure you're personalizing this to whoever you're shopping it to. And I would say this, you could apply a lot of these concepts we're talking today to if you're pitching for a major contract too. Like, it's not that different if you're kind of got a new industry that you're breaking into. So you could pull some similar themes out of it. The proposal itself at a high level adjusts sort of, who I am, why the timeline. Then the meat of it was really about the target market, the audience for the book, and the promotion plan. That would definitely be the core of it because I knew that was going to be what's most important and the gaps that I had to address. And then the back half of the book was sort of a sample table of contents, sample chapter I included, so they could get a feel for what I wanted the book to sort of sound like and just the general feeling that the overall project would have. So those were the high level portions of the proposal.
Okay, so at this point, a couple of things that you mentioned, you had to put together, you had to know who the target market was. You had to do some research there. You had to do your market research and those kind of pieces. And so I think this is kind of the big mystery for a lot of people is it's like you have this great idea for a book, but you don't know how to come up with that kind of information. Like you just have this gut feeling. Like I have this idea for a book. I've talked to my friends and I know this is a book they would buy or that would really speak to them. But there's like a disconnect between having that gut feeling, I know this could be something, and actually getting the supporting detail to show to a publisher or an agent that this has legs, this has merit, and here's why. So how did you go about how did you start with that piece? Because I think that's where a lot of people kind of go, I don't know.
I know. And it is tricky. And then once you identify it, it just flows. So you're right. I knew in my gut this was a great idea. I believed in it. I loved it. I knew it would sell. So now it starts the reverse engineering process. Why would it sell? It would sell because my dearest friend would buy it. Okay, who is she? Well, this is where you kind of get into the granular piece. I started to create these avatars, these people, and they were kind of real people, but they were kind of imaginary people. So they were people that I knew would buy it. So if you've got a great idea, the first thing you have to say is, well, who's going to buy this book? And you have to start thinking about all the characteristics of those people. And I'm talking about beyond gender and employment status. I'm talking about what kind of magazines do they buy? What does their house look like? Where do they spend their disposable income? Do they eat out? Do they eat in? Because when you're selling a book, you're competing with everybody's discretionary income. And you have to have a compelling reason for them to take that sliver, that $25 that they're going to spend at the bookstore, and choose to make it on your book, not on a piece of jewelry or a handbag, not on another book on the shelf in the same genre, but your book. So you really have to slice and dice and identify who these people are and where they spend their time and their money. For example, for me, for my book On Boards, which focuses on cheese boards and very simple recipes, I knew that these were going to be mostly women. I knew that they would have some keen interest in either fashion, home decor, or food, or all of it. What I knew is they didn't have to be chefs. These didn't have to be women who cooked. They could be women who just like to entertain. They didn't have to be experts in the kitchen, which is a little different than the traditional cookbook, where you tend to be geared toward people who enjoy cooking. So I knew that people that liked interior design, that appreciated aesthetics, I knew they'd be a fit because these boards were all about aesthetics. I knew that they liked magazines, and they probably were the people that bought the Home and Garden magazine or the Bon Appetit magazine that had really thoughtfully presented food or thoughtfully styled rooms because they appreciated that aesthetic. I knew that they were people that wanted to be recognized or acknowledged for their efforts. You don't put together a big cheese board not to have people go, wow, that's beautiful. So I knew that there was some personality traits that were part of it. And from that, I was able to kind of come up with 3 profiles of who my buyer would be. I gave them names in my proposal. So, there would be the Lana, who was an affluent stay-at-home mom and didn't have work outside of that. And I talked about the things that she likes and how she does. And, maybe she's not overly confident in the kitchen, but is open to trying things. And then I would talk about Doreen, who was an executive in her 40s who had no time for any of that, but needed to be able to put out something before she ordered in dinner. And this was something she could do. And so I kind of went through, identified their ages, their work, where they lived, how they spent their time, if they had kids or not. Like, I got granular because then I could see them in my mind, and it made it so much easier to talk about the book when I knew exactly who was buying it. And I think this concept applies to whatever niche you're in, whether you're knitting or you're talking about journaling or calligraphy or whatever your book idea or your project proposal is about. Think about who that end buyer is and get to know them intimately, because that's going to bring so much clarity to you, and it really helps the publisher.
Oh my gosh, avatars are, yes, absolutely. And it doesn't just apply to a book proposal. This applies to your business as a whole. Like, you should have avatars for, like, you should know who the people are that buy your paintings or that buy your crocheted headbands from your Etsy shop.
Or listen to your podcast.
Or listen to your podcast or read your blog. Like, you should know who those people are intimately. That's how you build and grow your business. Whether you have a book idea in mind or not, this is a really valuable exercise to go through. And I think I even have a worksheet somewhere of how you can build an avatar that might be really useful. Maybe we could put that in the show notes.
One of the best ways is just to think about your group of friends or your community of the people who you think you've got this great idea for a reason. You must have one person. And I just started with one person. I knew one person that would love my book. And from there, you can start to slice and dice it even thinner. And don't be afraid to get too thin with it. It really does bring clarity, and it's going to help your publisher know where to market that book, because that's the next part to it.
Yeah, so that's another way where you've just made this proposal as much about your publisher as about you. You've solved an issue for them. Like, you've made it so they don't even need to really think about who the book is for. You've told them very clearly and in a lot of detail, actually, of like, this is who I'm writing this for.
Yeah, when I was presenting the proposal in person, we were going through it. My publisher was nodding his head in agreement, like, yeah, this makes sense. This is consistent. I can draw these lines. Like, I was connecting dots for him.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it, connecting dots.
So that they don't have to do the work. They don't have to go back to their office and really think about this. And is this right? Like, you're making those connections there with them and making it easy for them. Yeah, you're making it easier for them, for sure.
You mentioned that you had spreadsheets in your book proposal, which is something they didn't see very often. What were you putting in those spreadsheets?
Well, I think this is a big part of when you are creating a small business. This is an important exercise. And so I added it into my book proposal as well. I think it's done sometimes. I don't think it's super common. I did a very in-depth competition analysis. So I went in and said, who is my book competing with? Because if you go in and say yours is the only one, yours is the best, no one would buy anything else, that's not true. You have to be realistic that people will choose other books over yours. And so I didn't shy away from that. I hit it head on. I went in and said, here are the other books that are competing in my category. And here is why someone would choose that book and why someone would choose my book and how I'm going to mitigate that. So I did these spreadsheets and I showed where that book ranked on Amazon, where it ranked at Barnes & Noble, where it ranked at Indigo. I showed right into the detail of when the book was published, any sort of data I could find on the book. And then I started to say how we could position mine differently against those books. So it was a very good exercise. They were very happy that I had that in there because, again, they didn't have to go do that work.
Yeah, you made that very easy for them.
They're going to go do the work. So a competition analysis in whatever space you're in is really an important exercise in the proposal. And it may show you your book's not a good fit. It may show you that this is a saturated market. I knew in my heart I was never going to do a family cookbook. I felt like, in my opinion, the market is super saturated. I didn't have a particularly unique perspective on it. I had beautiful recipes that I stand behind. I think I could create a beautiful book, but it would not stand out against all the other books, especially without a platform. So I knew that. I knew my lane. That wasn't going to be it. You can have these great ideas and really believe in something, but if you go through that competition analysis and realize I'm really not that much different, how am I going to stand out from all these other ones? It might be time to rethink the idea or put a different twist on it.
Yeah, it is a really good exercise to go through, not just for your publisher, but for yourself. And I think you're absolutely right. I think if you had proposed a general family cookbook, the fact that you didn't have a platform would have harmed you, because I think that, like you said, that is a very competitive niche, let's just say, and you need to stand out. That's where you do need to have that built-in audience. But the more niche you go and the more you stray away from those saturated markets, not just in book proposals, but just in anything you do with your business, the greater chance you have of building your following as a result of putting something out there that people are looking for, but that isn't necessarily being provided.
Exactly. You have to know how you're going to stand out. You don't want to go into these meetings and not know that a book on your subject matter was just published 18 months ago and is now in the bargain bin or is now a bestseller. Like, you need to know what your competitors are doing.
And I think even when your book did finally come out, even though this had been in the works for years, you kind of hit the market at a point where quite a few other books in the same genre came out as well. You were competing against books that hadn't even been published yet when you put together your competitive analysis.
It's very true. There were, and it was so disheartening because there really wasn't a book like mine at the time. And then, it was about that 6 months before pub date, and all of a sudden a book with very similar feel to mine came out. And yeah, you just feel a bit gutted because you think, oh, that's it. There's no chance. But that's not where it ends, because that's a good segue into sort of the next part of the proposal is, how will this book be marketed and positioned out in the marketplace?
So I think one of the important things to realize with the publishing industry is that it's not the publishing industry that it was 20 years ago. Just because you write a book doesn't mean your publisher is going to send you out on an all-expense paid book tour. That's very unlikely.
Very unlikely.
And you will very unlikely. And you will be expected to play a considerable role in marketing your book. You really can't rely on the publisher to do all the work when it comes to marketing. I see this all the time with bloggers talking about getting a cookbook deal and sort of thinking once the book is written, that's it, they're done. But that's actually, you're really only at the halfway point when the book is actually published.
You really are. A lot of heavy lifting.
You haven't sold a single copy yet.
Yeah. You know what? It's an interesting process because there's a lot of work. And then when it goes over to be printed, which usually is overseas if you're going traditional, there's this quiet period because nothing really is getting done. It's very quiet. The book's off being printed and you've got a bit of breather. And then, of course, yes, once it hits the market, like the legwork, what was a solitary experience for 18 months becomes an incredibly social and public experience.
Yeah. So let's talk about the whole marketing piece, because as we've mentioned, you didn't have an audience. You'd be what would be called as maybe like a nano influencer with your
that would be generous
1,000 followers. But this is not necessarily a mistake, because I understand why this happens. But often when somebody starts to write a book, it's a very labor intensive process and they disappear like completely. Mm-hmm. You don't hear, like, we've seen this so many times where a blogger has disappeared and you're like, I wonder if they're writing a book. And sure enough, 18 months later, they resurface and they're like, here's my book. And nobody's heard from them in months. And it's like, oh, well, okay. But I think one of the things that you recognized very early on is that you didn't have a platform and you were going to have to start making some inroads into getting your name out there and getting people to recognize who you were and to have a little bit of clout behind you, so that when people did buy your book, if they decided to look a little deeper and find out more about you, there would be things to find. Mm-hmm. I know just from some of the work we did together that you actually started strategizing about this very, very early, long before your proposal was accepted.
Yes, I knew from the get-go that I wasn't going to write a proposal that said, and every bookstore will carry my book front and center. Like, that wasn't going to be my marketing plan. My marketing plan was kind of twofold. One, I wanted to think of the unobvious is not a word. The not obvious?
Less obvious.
The less obvious? The less obvious sales distribution channels. So instead of saying, hey, I think my book will be great in Indigo, the Canadian Barnes & Noble piece, I talked about all the other places my book would be a great fit. So I found alternative distribution channels like home goods retailers, grocery stores, different department stores, different places that wouldn't traditionally carry every book, but I could make a case for why mine would be good there. And that was one of the key pieces to having it not blend in with everything else that was out there, was saying, where else do people buy books? I did this book knowing it would be a very giftable book. And so I thought, where do people buy gifts? And let's talk about how I can make a difference at those channels. I said yes to everything. And if it was a kitchen store, I knew that that's where it was going to go. And I would be there to sign books. I would be there to do demos. I would be front and center with this and show that what I was talking about in the book could be executed very easily. I really wanted to demonstrate that. So I said yes to everything and knew that my face being out there, showing people and connecting with people was going to make a difference in the success of this book.
Yeah, that's something to think about if a book is on your mind, is start thinking about all the places where you see books being sold. It's not just Amazon and it's not just your local bookstore. It's like you said, it's things like gift shops and kitchen shops and airports. Yeah, and you know what? But what do people do before they get on a flight? They buy a book.
People want gifts, and exactly.
Or they realize they don't have a gift for their hostess who's they're staying with at the other end. So I got to get her something, right? And your book is perfect for that. But things like even conferences and workshops. How often do you see the author with a stack of book next to them at a table? Like there's a lot of places where you can buy a book that aren't just the bookstore. So that's always something to really that would be a great thing to make a list of and start thinking about, like, how could I approach those people, or how could my publisher approach those people and get this book into their hands?
Exactly. This is the whole connect the dots, make it easier on your publisher. Give them the ideas as to where they could sell the book, because they haven't always thought of them. There were ones that I brought up to my publisher that they hadn't considered or didn't think of it. And then once the idea set, it made sense at the time.
Yeah, I think one of the things to realize is that a lot of those smaller places that you might not have originally thought of, a lot of them are very highly curated. You know, I'm thinking especially of like gift shops and kitchen shops. The people who own those places are usually local owners. They know their market and their neighborhood really well, and they pick products that they know are going to be a surefire winner for their customers. And it's almost like they're putting their own personal sign of approval on it. Like, in my store, because I think you need to have it, right? Like, they're not going to put something in there that's a waste of their customers' time. So if you can, and I know you did this, you made some relationships with the people who own those stores and got your books in there.
I did. And you know what? They were more successful. Some of the smaller distributors were more successful because of that personal connection. They had a more intimate relationship with their inventory management system. So they knew they knew how many to get in. They also knew their customers really well. And it's not to take away from the bigger stores, because I had a lot of success with Indigo and they have been an incredible partner in this. But I think I was sort of expecting that success. I wasn't expecting the success with some of these smaller retails that couldn't keep it in stock because of the word of mouth. It's almost like that movement these days toward, and I'm not using the right term, but like the micro influencers, where if you have only 2,000 followers, but a more intimate relationship than 20,000 followers who don't have that relationship with you, it can be more valuable to have a smaller footprint. And I think some of these small stores in these communities have incredible loyal customers that will support them anyway. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree with you. That's how a lot of this can be done. It's not about making moving the needle huge, 100,000 copies sold. It's amazing how much 10 copies here and 5 copies here and 4 copies all around makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to recognize, is that having a huge follower count doesn't translate into sales. It really doesn't. A huge follower count is a great way to get the word out, but it's not necessarily the relationships with their followers that those kind of influencers have are not intimate relationships. But when you have a smaller influencer they are called nano influencers, people who have like less than 10,000 followers, those people can often generate huge sales for a product because they really do know who the people following them are. They talk to them regularly. They have, really far more intimate relationships with those people. And so again, they're like the curators. They're like the ones who say, you know what, this book is fantastic. It's changed the way I entertain. And here's why. And I think, I think this would be great for anybody who's in the same situation as me. We always joke in the influencer market that you can't pay bills with exposure. And that's very true. When you've got influencers with huge numbers, yes, that gets you exposure. It gets eyeballs on your product, but it does not translate into dollar bills. And you need the dollar bills to pay your rent. So
well, and ironically, the way I ended up using influencers with my book is that I didn't have an audience, but we did leverage some nano influencers that did. And so, that was part of my strategy as well, is getting my book out to random influencers, and they ended up promoting it. And it, I definitely had a lot of success with the smaller ones versus some of the larger ones that are doing that all the time. I found that I chose influencers that I knew the book made sense for. It was the right connection. You can just tell the results from it speak for themselves.
I think also you did a few other things. We spent some time working on your website before you did your book proposal. And that was one of the things we talked about. I remember you having that conversation with me that this was sort of your ultimate goal, was to create this book about serving food on boards. And so you were even thinking that far out in advance of how you could start showing the world that you were this person who understood how a lot of parents out there want to cook and serve and entertain. You actually pitched a content idea to us at Food Bloggers of Canada on a column called On Boards, like on board in 20 minutes, basically serving up a family meal in 20 minutes and serving it family style on a board.
It was, that's right.
And I think that was even mentioned in somewhere in sales piece of one of your books that you wrote this column called on board in 20.
I think it is. I don't know if it's on the back of the book or if it's somewhere, but you're right. It is. Or you know what? It might even be on the Amazon description. Yes.
I do remember we had a chuckle over it when we saw that. But the point of that being that, if somebody who maybe didn't know you from Instagram or Twitter, Facebook or anything, bought your book and started looking around for more content from you. Like, here was this collection of articles that you had written, not just on your website, but you had written it on a third party website, which I think is another thing a lot of people neglect, is like those third party publications. In some ways, those almost give you more authority because somebody else has said, yeah, we recognize that this person knows what they're talking about and we want them publishing content through our publication.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you had people who could be like, oh, Lisa, like, this is great. What else has she done? And then they go look for you. And yeah, there was other stuff to find. There was your blog. There was other content that you had written and published elsewhere. And it did give you, so, maybe you didn't have authority in the sense that you had followers, but you had authority in other ways that were just as meaningful.
And they were complementary. So while they weren't On Boards that I did for Food Bloggers of Canada was never cheese board based. But if someone saw the post that I did for Food Bloggers of Canada and then saw the book, you wouldn't say, well, those are like two different people. It was very consistent in that. So you could make that connection, which I agree with you. I think that's important.
Yeah. And I think this is something where there is going to be that period where you're writing the book and it's going to be very labor intensive and you're going to disappear. And even though you shouldn't disappear, even though like how important it is to be out there and be seen, you're balancing a lot of things and a ball has to drop somewhere. But if you have content on other websites or other things that you sort of have in the can that can be dripped out while you're going through the writing process, or a blog where you have other content, that's all stuff that you can still repurpose and get out there during that quiet period. You can schedule social media posts for all that older content. Nobody needs to know that it was published 2 years ago or a year ago, right? I mean,
absolutely. This is the key. Like we talked about that last episode, a couple episodes about batching. If you're going to endeavor, if you're fortunate enough to just even to write your proposal, which should be an in-depth piece of work, but even if beyond that, you're actually getting into writing the book, planning is so key to that. So you're absolutely right that you don't disappear from the face of the earth.
We just talked about writing for third-party publications. This is another great way because you know what? They're going to promote that content while you're busy writing your book. Like it's on their best interest to have traffic, magazine sales and newspaper sales and all those kinds of things. Like, they earn revenue from that. So they're going to be repurposing and promoting content that you've written for them. And a lot of people get a little touchy about that, but honestly, that's a bonus when you are not in a position to be putting fresh content out there yourself, because you don't want people to forget about you, especially if you do. The more followers you have, the more obvious it is when you disappear. So in some ways, having a smaller audience was helpful in that case. Like, it wasn't
nobody knew I was not there. It's the truth, though. You can't argue the numbers. It's the absolute truth. And you're right. It is a way to to get that. I think if you're taking on that endeavor, I was very militant about how I was going to get all the work done and continue to keep up obligations like writing and keeping new content coming and keeping myself out there as much as I could. And there's no question there was a dip, but you have to approach that very intentionally because nobody calls to check up on you. When you get a deal with a publisher and they say, okay, we need your manuscript, in 6 months, they're not really checking in to see how's it coming. Are you meeting your deadlines? They trust that you're going to get the work done, and you cannot cram a manuscript. You need to plan the time, and it goes by fast, and it's hard, and it's isolating. So you really have to go in with templates for this is what I'm going to get done this week in these times, and that time has to be sacred, because if you're not planning for it, it'll go by in the blink of an eye, and you'll be, the last thing you want to do. I was determined I was never going to ask for an extension, and people ask for an extension and life happens, but I felt that they were taking a chance on me and I wasn't going to let them down.
So out of all the things that you did through that whole process, what do you think it was that really stood out to your particular publisher that got their attention and made them say, this is a book and an author that we want to welcome into our publishing company?
It's a tough question. I don't know if it's one particular thing. I think I had an idea that was unique to their lineup, and I was able to articulate it in such a way that it evoked emotion. I wrote in my proposal that I could write a book on 101 ways to cook a chicken. That's not evoking emotion. It's very factual and something you could Google search. I wanted to create something that was emotional and that people wanted to be a part of. So I felt like my idea drew upon that before it drew upon cheese. I didn't focus on the cheese part of it. I didn't focus on the meat and charcuterie part.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't even think of your book as a cheese book. I think of it more like, I really do think of it as like an entertaining and lifestyle book, like just a great way to entertain your friends and family by serving like on a grazing board kind of thing. It's just interesting how different people are going to view your work.
I think a big part too that made me easy to work with, if I can say so, was that I was professional and I was open to their feedback. And I know that this isn't always going to be the case. I'll restate that. You should always be professional. Being open to feedback is not always going to be the case. I was somebody who was committed to writing a book about cheese boards. I didn't feel incredibly tied to the aesthetic of the book. So just even designing the book is a real process. And there's so many talented people. I went in saying they're the experts. My goal here was to sell X number of copies. And if the art department at Penguin Random House thinks that this is the font we should use, I gave that a lot of weight. Not all authors are going to feel that way. There are people that are incredibly tied to the aesthetics of their book, and they feel personally that the paperweight should be this and not this. I really relinquished a lot of that, and I picked the spots that I wanted to maintain control of, and I was always a professional about it, and I think that made me easy to work with and made the process smoother. And I know that that can be a tricky balance sometimes. Putting your work out there and having it come back edited to shreds and being able to say, okay, I'll take that feedback and move forward can be tough sometimes on the ego. It can be tough emotionally. But if you really can separate, and I think this is a theme I often bring up in our podcast, is if you can separate emotion from business and decide what you really do need to fight for, and I do believe in that. There's going to be things that you do need to fight for, and what you can respect is a business decision, and there are experts who know how to sell books. Penguin Random House knows and still knows how to sell books. And so I put a lot of trust in those decisions around pricing and look and feel, which I do think helped our relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, is that when you go into this kind of process or any kind of big project where you're working with a client, which essentially is what Penguin Random House was. They were your client. They were paying you money to write this book for them. There's always going to be things that you have an emotional tie to. And I think it's really important to recognize, before you even enter into the process, is to really think about what are the things that are non-negotiables for you, because there probably will be a few. There just are, because we're humans. But at the same time, you have to recognize that not everything can be a non-negotiable. You need to have more things on your list that are negotiable than non-negotiable, so that when those things that are really important to you are, threaten's not the right word, but you kind of get what I'm saying. You can stand up for them and fight for them. But at the same time, you have to be willing to let a lot of other things go, so that when you do stand up and fight for them, people stop and listen, because, up till this point, you've been very flexible and open to feedback. And now you're saying, no, this doesn't work. This isn't what I want. So they're more likely to give you the time of day and let you speak your piece and listen to what you have to say and evaluate it. I do know of a few instances where people have gone through the book process and fought every single decision. And that's just draining for everyone.
For everybody. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say that's probably a big part of it, was being professional, meeting my deadlines, being open to feedback. Those things, they all play a big part of this. Yeah, they do. They really do.
Yeah. And we've talked about deadlines before several times on the podcast. Deadlines. Hit them. Hitting your deadlines will get you further than almost anything else in your career.
I know. I feel there's a likability factor and being reliable. And if you can check some of those boxes, you're going to be someone people want to spend time with.
Before we wrap up, is there anything else about the process that you think people should be aware of?
I can't stress enough the importance of putting the time in up front, and the truth of the old saying of, you can, one time to make a first impression, you only have once. It's hard to go back to a publisher again and again. Here's a revised idea. Well, what about this way? It's worth putting in the time with the proposal stage to really flush out your idea and all aspects of it. And I would be happy to talk to anybody if you've got questions or you're thinking about it and you want to have a further conversation about it. I would absolutely encourage you to reach out. I'm more than happy to talk about it. But I would just say, don't rush to getting your pitch in front of eyeballs until you really feel like you've gone through the process and you've made it impossible for them to say no.
Well, thanks, Lisa, for sharing all your experience with us. And I do think, you really do prove the point that if you have something interesting and important to say, you can get it said.
There's an audience for it. Absolutely.
Okay, everyone. I think that's all we have time for this week, but thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Lisa, for sharing all your info. And thanks, everyone. We will talk to you all next week.
Thank you so much for joining us for the And She Looked Up Creative Hour. Be sure to check out the show notes for any links or resources we talked about in this episode. If you enjoyed the chat, please be sure to subscribe, and you will automatically be notified when the new shows are released, and we'd love to hear from you. Drop us a review, tell us where you're listening from, or even just send a note to say hi. You can find us at andshelookedup.com or on Instagram under andshelookedup. Thanks so much for listening.